I watched the unopened letter on our kitchen table for 3 days before finally tearing into it. The expensive cream envelope with its embossed return address for Hartman Associates had been taunting me each morning as I made coffee. I knew exactly what it contained: divorce papers from my husband of 12 years. The signs had been there for months: hushed phone calls, late nights at the office, and the gradual disappearance of funds from our joint account. When I finally slid my finger under the seal, my hands weren't even shaking. That surprised me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Financial dissolution of marriage. I murmured, scanning the formal language that effectively ended my relationship with Richard. The irony wasn't lost on me. After paying off his $347,000 in debt just 6 months ago, a combination of failed business ventures, tax liens, and the sports car he needed for client impressions, he was filing for an equitable division of assets. I placed the papers down and reached for my coffee, letting the bitter liquid wash over my tongue as I stared out at the Manhattan skyline from our 28th floor apartment. An apartment my inheritance had purchased outright 5 years ago, when Richard convinced me it was the investment opportunity of a lifetime. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Elise, my oldest friend and financial advisor. Meeting. Confirmed with Preston Holdings, 10 a.m. Good news on the Richardson transfer. Call me. I smiled for the first time in days. At least something was going according to plan. When I married Richard Davenport at 30, I was Alexandra Pierce, newly appointed CFO of my family's third-generation investment firm, Pierce Financials. My grandfather had built the company from nothing during the post-war boom. My father had expanded it internationally, and I had modernized it for the digital age. Richard had been dazzling, charming at dinner parties, attentive in private, ambitious about his fledgling marketing consultancy. "You handle the money, I'll handle the connections," he'd said during our honeymoon in Santorini, raising a glass of champagne against the Mediterranean sunset. "We'll be unstoppable." What he really meant, as I would learn over the years, was that I would handle everything while he spent recklessly, chased investment schemes, and gradually came to resent the very success he'd once admired in me. I gathered the divorce papers and slid them into my briefcase. My legal team would review them this afternoon. Right now, I had a more pressing appointment. The offices of Preston Holdings occupied the top floor of a sleek building in Midtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Central Park, and abstract art pieces worth more than most people's homes adorned the walls. Marcus Preston, silver-haired and impeccably suited, rose from behind his desk as I entered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Alexandra. He greeted warmly, extending his hand. "Always a pleasure. Though I must say, when Elise mentioned you were accelerating our timeline, I was surprised." I took his hand firmly. "Life has a way of forcing decisions, Marcus. Thank you for accommodating me." He gestured to a seating area where Elise already waited, tablet in hand, her auburn hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that emphasized her sharp features and sharper mind. "The transfers are complete," she said without preamble as I sat beside her. "Preston Holdings now officially controls the majority share of the Richardson Group, with all subsidiaries intact, including—" She paused, allowing herself a small smile. "First Metropolitan Bank." I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "And the paperwork?" Marcus slid a folder across the glass coffee table. "All here. As per your instructions, the acquisition was conducted through 7 separate holding companies, each with its own management structure. On paper, Preston Holdings is merely a minor investor. The true ownership is as obfuscated as legally possible." "And, Richard?" I asked, opening the folder to scan the documents. Elise's smile tightened. "Completely unaware. His name appears nowhere in the chain of ownership. Even if someone were investigating specifically, it would take months to connect everything, back to Pierce Financials, let alone to you personally. Good. I closed the folder. And his loans. Marcus cleared his throat. All of them, personal, business, and the 3 credit lines, have been acquired by First Metropolitan as of this morning. His entire debt structure is now under your control, though of course he has no way of knowing that. The irony was almost too perfect. 6 months ago, I had paid off all of Richard's debts after he came to me, humiliated and desperate, claiming it was his rock-bottom moment. He'd promised change, transparency, a new beginning. 3 months. Later, I discovered he was having an affair with Vanessa Keller, his young VP of Client Relations. 1 month after that, I learned he was siphoning money from our joint accounts into a private one I wasn't meant to discover, so I made my own plans. "What's your next move?" Elise asked as we left Preston's office, stepping into the private elevator. Checked my watch. Richard doesn't know I've received the divorce papers yet. He's away at a conference in Chicago. I made air quotes, knowing full well he was there with Vanessa. He'll be back tomorrow expecting to blindside me. Elise raised an eyebrow. And instead? Instead, I'll be having dinner with Edward Richardson tonight. Her eyes widened slightly. The Richardson patriarch himself? I thought he never took meetings. He makes exceptions for the person who just saved his family's company from hostile takeover, I replied, as the elevator doors opened to the lobby. Especially when that person has a proposition regarding his son-in-law. The restaurant was exactly what you'd expect for someone of Edward Richardson's stature. Private, elegant, and discreet. The kind of place where deals reshaping entire industries were made over rare wines and perfectly cooked steaks, where the staff were trained to see everything and reveal nothing. Edward was already seated when I arrived, his imposing frame somehow making the high-backed leather chair seem small. At 76, he still had a full head of white hair, and the piercing blue eyes that had made him famous in business circles for seeing through pretense. "Ms. Pierce," he said, rising slightly as I approached. Or should I say Mrs. Davenport? "Alexandra." "Is fine," I replied, taking the seat across from him. "Though soon enough, it will be Ms. Pierce again." He nodded, studying me with interest. "My investigators mentioned your marital situation. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn." "Not at all. In fact, it's relevant to our conversation." I paused as a waiter appeared silently, pouring a deep red wine into my glass. "I took the liberty of ordering the 2005 Chateau Margaux," Edward said. "I recall from our previous correspondence that you appreciate Bordeaux." I smiled, impressed by his attention to detail. "You have an excellent memory. Details matter in our world, Alexandra. Speaking of which," he leaned forward slightly, "I'm curious about why you orchestrated such an elaborate rescue of my company, only to immediately request this meeting. Direct and perceptive. I respected that. First," I said, taking a sip of the exceptional wine, "it wasn't entirely altruistic. The Richardson Group is a sound investment, particularly with the restructuring you've implemented." He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Second, I have a particular interest in one of your subsidiaries, First Metropolitan Bank." His eyes narrowed, slightly. "The smallest piece of our portfolio. Hardly worth the effort you've expended." "It's not about the size, but the strategic position. First Metropolitan holds all of my husband's debt. Debt I recently paid off, only to discover he's been less than faithful, in all senses of the word." Understanding dawned on Edward's face. "Ah, and now you control the bank that could, theoretically, recall those debts or adjust their terms." "Precisely." Our meals arrived, perfectly seared scallops. For me, rare steak for him. We spent a moment in appreciative silence before continuing. "What exactly are you proposing, Alexandra?" Edward finally asked. "I want your permission, as the former majority owner and current board chairman, to make certain adjustments to my husband's accounts. Nothing illegal. I clarified. But perhaps creative. Edward cut a precise piece of steak, considering my words. You know, my first wife left me for my business partner in 1986. Took half my worth and my best client relationships with her. I waited, sensing there was more. The second Mrs. Richardson was cleverer. She documented my affairs, hired investigators, and presented me with a choice: an extremely public, extremely expensive divorce, or a private arrangement on her terms. He smiled faintly. We've been happily married for 30 years now. And the arrangement? I couldn't help asking. I signed over 3 properties, established a foundation in her name with a $100 million endowment, and learned a valuable lesson about respecting one's partner. He took a sip of wine. What I'm saying, Alexandra, is that I appreciate a strategic mind, particularly when it's employed not just for revenge, but for justice. Then you'll help? I'll do better than that. Edward reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small flash drive, sliding it across the table. My son-in-law, Curtis, is the current president of First Metropolitan. This contains his direct contact information and authorization codes for the bank's executive systems. He'll be expecting your call. I took the drive, surprised by his directness. Thank you. May I ask why you're being so accommodating? Edward Richardson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say I recognize something of myself in you. The difference is, when I was building my empire, I trampled people who deserved better. You're eliminating someone who deserves worse. He raised his glass. To justice, creatively applied. We clinked glasses, and I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. The plan was in motion. Back in my apartment that evening, I accessed the flash drive Edward had given me. Inside was a single document with contact information for Curtis Richardson and a handwritten note. Curtis understands the situation. Call any time. I glanced at the clock, nearly midnight, but this couldn't wait. Richard would be home tomorrow, expecting to deliver his divorce bombshell. Everything needed to be in place before then. Curtis answered on the second ring, sounding fully awake despite the hour. Alexandra Pierce? I've been expecting your call? Your father-in-law works quickly, I replied. Edward doesn't believe in wasting time, especially when it comes to people he respects. He briefed me on your situation and requirements. And you're willing to help? I asked, cutting to the chase. Let me be clear. What you're asking isn't strictly illegal, but it does push certain boundaries. The bank has recently acquired your husband's debt portfolio, which gives us significant latitude in how we manage those accounts. I'm not asking for anything that would reflect poorly on First Metropolitan, I assured him. I understand that. From what Edward tells me, you're looking for controlled consequences, not destruction. Exactly. There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling. I have your husband's file in front of me. Richard Anthony Davenport, age 44. Owner of Davenport Marketing Solutions, though our records show the company has been operating at a loss for 3 consecutive quarters. That was news to me. Richard had claimed his business was thriving, another lie to add to the collection. Curtis continued. He has a personal checking account, a business account, a personal investment account, and 3 credit cards with us. As of 2 months ago, all previous debt was paid in full. By you, I presume? Yes. But in the last 6 weeks, he's accumulated new debt totaling approximately $95,000. High-end hotel charges, jewelry purchases, first-class airfare for 2 to Chicago, and previously to Cabo San Lucas. My stomach tightened. Cabo had been where we spent our 10th anniversary. He was recreating our memories with another woman, using my money. The good news, Curtis said, his tone shifting to something more professional, is that this gives us several options for how to proceed. What exactly did you have in mind? I outlined my plan, feeling a calm certainty as the details fell into place. Curtis occasionally asked clarifying questions or suggested refinements, his banking expertise complementing my financial strategy. "We can implement everything first thing tomorrow," he confirmed when we'd finalized the details. "By the time Richard Davenport returns to New York, the groundwork will be laid." "Perfect," I said. "There's one more thing. He can't know I'm behind this. Not yet." "Of course. As far as he'll be concerned, these are standard banking procedures following the recent acquisition. Nothing will trace back to you until you're ready for that revelation." After ending the call, I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Richard had always loved this view, often bringing clients here to impress them with his success. Tomorrow, he would return expecting to take control of the situation with his surprise divorce papers. Instead, he would find the first threads of his life beginning to unravel. I opened my laptop one last time before bed, sending a brief email to my legal team. "Proceed with counterfiling. Use Portfolio B as discussed." Then I forwarded Richard's travel itinerary to the private investigator I'd hired weeks ago with a simple instruction. Final documentation required. Full surveillance upon arrival. Sleep came easily that night, perhaps for the first time in months. Morning brought a flurry of confirmations. Curtis had implemented all the agreed-upon changes to Richard's accounts. My legal team had the counter-divorce filing prepared with an extensive list of Richard's indiscretions, ready to submit, the moment he filed his own papers. The investigator confirmed he was in position at JFK for Richard's noon arrival. At 11:45, I received a text from Curtis. "Systems updated. Phase 1 complete." At 12:38, a notification from the investigator arrived. A photo of Richard and Vanessa exiting the airport, his arm around her waist, both laughing. I enlarged the image, noting the new watch on his wrist, undoubtedly purchased with the funds he'd been diverting. At 1:15, Richard texted me. "Flight delayed. Be home by 3. We need to talk." I responded simply, "I'll be here." The stage was set. Richard would arrive expecting to find his financially dependent wife unaware of his plans. Instead, he would be meeting Alexandra Pierce, the woman who now controlled every aspect of his financial life without his knowledge. I spent the next hour reviewing documents with Elise, who had arrived with a thick folder of financial statements and projections. "First Metropolitan has frozen his business line of credit," she confirmed, pointing to a notification. "And as we discussed, they've identified potential irregularities in his personal accounts that require temporary holds." "How long before he notices?" I asked. "The moment he tries to use any of his cards or access his accounts. So likely within hours of his arrival." I nodded, satisfied. "And the apartment?" "The trust transfer is complete. The property is now solely in your name, with documentation showing that your personal funds, pre-marriage, were used for the purchase. His name has been removed from all ownership records. His key fob? Deactivated as of noon. Security has been notified that he'll need to check in as a visitor." I closed the folder. "Thank you, Elise. I couldn't have orchestrated this without you." She squeezed my hand. "He deserves everything that's coming. Do you want me to stay when he arrives?" I shook my head. "No. This is a conversation we need to have alone." After Elise left, I changed into a simple black dress and pearl earrings. Richard's first gift to me when we were dating. A subtle reminder of better times before everything changed. I had just poured myself a glass of water when the house phone rang. "Ms. Pierce," came the voice of Anthony, our building's head of security. "Mr. Davenport is in the lobby. His access appears to be deactivated. Should I send him up?" "Yes, Anthony. And could you please ensure we're not disturbed?" "Of course, Ms. Pierce." 5 minutes later, the elevator pinged, and Richard strode into our apartment, irritation evident in his furrowed brow. At 44, he was still handsome, tall and athletic, with dark hair graying attractively at the temples. Today, he wore the confident expression of a man about to execute a well-planned strategy. "What's going on with my access?" he demanded without preamble. And why is the doorman calling you Ms. Pierce? I took a deliberate sip of water. I've been making some changes. His eyes narrowed as he placed his briefcase on the counter. The same briefcase that undoubtedly contained his copy of the divorce papers. What kind of changes? The building's ownership records have been updated to reflect the actual financial arrangement. Since my inheritance purchased this apartment outright, it seemed appropriate. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face, quickly replaced by practiced charm. Alex, honey, this isn't the conversation I planned for us to have right away, but you mean before or after your weekend with Vanessa in Chicago? I interrupted calmly. He froze momentarily, then recovered. That's a business relationship. You're jumping to conclusions. Business relationships don't usually involve purchasing matching Cartier bracelets or booking the honeymoon suite at the peninsula. I gestured to the envelope on the coffee table, my copy of the divorce papers. And they certainly don't precede divorce filings. The charm vanished from his expression, replaced by cold calculation. I see you've been snooping. Well, this actually makes things simpler. Yes, I want a divorce. Things haven't been working between us for a long time. Since approximately when I paid off your $347,000 debt? I asked pleasantly. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. I've been building my business, taking risks, failing spectacularly from what I hear. 3 consecutive quarters of losses? Who told you that? Richard snapped, then quickly composed. Himself. Temporary setbacks. The point is, we want different things. I need freedom to pursue my vision. With my money, I added. Our money, he corrected sharply. We've been married for 12 years. New York is an equitable distribution state. My lawyer has been very clear about my entitlements. I smiled for the first time since he'd entered. Is that what this is about? Your entitlements? Something in my tone must have worried him. Richard reached for his phone. I'm calling James. We should have the lawyers handle this conversation. He tapped his screen, frowned, and tapped again. Problem? I asked innocently. My banking app isn't working. He tried again, his frown deepening. And now it's saying my account access is temporarily restricted. How inconvenient, I murmured. Richard's eyes snapped to mine, suspicious now. What did you do? Me? Nothing. But from what I understand, First Metropolitan Bank has recently undergone an ownership change. Perhaps they're updating their systems. He pulled out his wallet and extracted a credit card. Fine, I'll deal with that later. Right now, we need to discuss the terms of our separation. My lawyer has prepared. Try the card first, I suggested. His brow furrowed. What? Your credit card. Try it before we continue. Richard's expression darkened as he pulled out his phone again and opened another app. After a moment, his face drained of color. My cards are being declined. All of them. Banking systems can be so temperamental, I said with a small shrug, especially during ownership transitions. He stared at me, realization dawning. The bank. You did something with the bank. I didn't confirm or deny, simply watching as he rapidly cycled through shock, confusion, and anger. This is harassment, he finally sputtered. You can't just freeze my accounts because you're angry about the divorce. I haven't done anything of the sort, I replied truthfully. First Metropolitan Bank is conducting a standard review of certain accounts following their acquisition. It's all perfectly normal procedure. Normal procedure doesn't target specific customers. It does when those customers have recent unusual activity. I picked up my tablet and turned it toward him, displaying his own transaction history. Like $95,000 in new debt accumulated over 6 weeks, primarily on luxury hotels, jewelry, and travel for 2. Richard's expression hardened. You're not going to get away with this. My lawyer will need to be paid. I finished for him. How do you plan to do that with frozen accounts? For the first time, genuine worry crept into his expression. This is temporary. You're trying to scare me. Am I? It won't work, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. I know my rights. We've been married long enough that I'm entitled to half of everything. Half of my family's company, half of my inheritance, half of the apartment my trust bought outright. I shook my head. Your lawyer should have explained about separate property. We've mingled our finances for years, he countered. That makes it marital property. Actually, it doesn't. Not when there's clear documentation showing the source of funds, and certainly not when there's evidence of one spouse attempting to hide assets. I slid a folder across the counter toward him. Like this private account you opened 3 months ago. Richard stared at the folder but didn't touch it. This is a misunderstanding. Is it? Then perhaps you can explain why you transferred $182,000 from our joint account to this private one. Or why you changed our mailing address for bank statements without telling me. Or why— Enough, he snapped, finally losing his composure. What do you want, Alex? Money? Fine, take it. The apartment? Keep it. But this vindictive freezing of my accounts has to stop. It's not vindictive, Richard. It's protective. The bank is simply ensuring that no further unauthorized activities occur while they investigate. I took another sip of water, which could take some time. His phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted from anger to panic. Vanessa says her card was just declined at the hotel. How unfortunate. You're going after her too? She has nothing to do with this. I'm not going after anyone, I replied calmly. But as an authorized user on your corporate card, she would naturally be affected by any review of your accounts. Richard ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling to process the rapidly deteriorating situation. I need to make some calls. Of course, though I should mention, your business line of credit has also been temporarily suspended pending review. He froze. What? Something about potential irregularities in recent applications. Probably just standard procedure. Richard's composure finally shattered. You're destroying everything I've built. No, Richard. You did that yourself the moment you decided. Your vows meant nothing. I stood up and walked to the door, signaling that our conversation was over. I suggest you find somewhere to stay tonight. Your access to this apartment has been revoked. You can't just throw me out. This is my home. Actually, it's not. As we've established, it never was. The ownership records now reflect that reality. I opened the door. You should gather whatever personal belongings you need. Anthony will escort you out when you're finished. Richard stared at me, a mixture of fury and disbelief on his face. This isn't over, Alex. I met his gaze steadily. Actually, it is. You just don't realize it yet. After he stormed into the bedroom to collect his things, I sent a quick text to Curtis. Phase 1 complete. Proceed with Phase 2. Richard emerged 20 minutes later with a hastily packed suitcase, his expression dark with barely contained rage. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, he threatened as he stepped into the elevator. I look forward to it, I replied pleasantly as the doors closed on his furious face. Alone in the apartment, I walked to the window, gazing out at the skyline that had witnessed both the beginning and end of my marriage. My phone buzzed with a message from Elise. All systems go. Ready for Phase 2 tomorrow? I texted back, absolutely. The real work begins now. Phase 1 had been about setting the stage, controlling Richard's immediate financial situation and establishing my position of strength. Phase 2 would reveal just how completely I now controlled his banking destiny, and how thoroughly I intended to use that control to deliver the justice he deserved. Morning arrived with a symphony of notifications on my phone. Richard had spent the night attempting to access his accounts, each failed attempt triggering an alert to my private email. 27 tries across 5 different platforms. His desperation was becoming measurable. I sipped my coffee, reviewing the overnight report Curtis had sent. Following our plan, First Metropolitan had not just frozen Richard's accounts, but had initiated a comprehensive security review that would keep his funds inaccessible for at least 5 business days. Meanwhile, automated messages had been sent to all vendors with recurring charges linked to his cards, notifying them of potential payment interruptions. My phone rang, Richard's third call since dawn. This time I answered. "You've made your point," he said immediately, his voice tight with restrained anger. "Now fix this." "Good morning to you too, Richard. Sleep well at the plaza?" I asked pleasantly, knowing exactly where his last working credit card had been used before it too was suspended. "How did you—" "Never mind. Listen, Alex, this has gone too far. I can't access any of my money. The hotel is asking for a new card. Vanessa is freaking out." "I imagined she would be," I replied. "Hard to maintain a lavish affair when the funding suddenly stops. This isn't about Vanessa. It's about you illegally, freezing my assets during divorce proceedings." "I haven't frozen anything, Richard. First Metropolitan Bank has placed a temporary hold pending review. It's standard procedure when they detect unusual activity." "Bullshit. You did something." I could hear him pacing. "I've called the bank 6 times. They keep referring me to a special review department that never answers. Banking bureaucracy can be frustrating. Cut the crap, Alex. I need access to my money. I have meetings, clients, bills." "Interesting how quickly priorities shift," I observed. "Yesterday, you were serving me divorce papers. Today, you're asking for my help." There was a pause, then a change in tactics. When he spoke again, his voice had softened, taking on the persuasive tone he used to charm clients. "Look, I know you're hurt. What I did was wrong, and we should talk about it properly. But this financial warfare isn't the answer. It's just going to make everything messier. Your concern for a clean process is touching, considering you were planning to blindside me with divorce papers while simultaneously draining our joint accounts." Another pause. "How did you know about the transfers? The private account? The fact that your business has been operating at a loss for 3 quarters while you told me it was thriving?" I let the question hang. "I know everything, Richard." Then, "You know I can't function like this. I have presentations next week, vendor payments due. Perhaps you should have considered those responsibilities before spending $95,000 on luxury hotels and jewelry for your girlfriend." His facade cracked. "God damn it, Alex. You can't just destroy my life because I fell in love with someone else." "I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply ensuring that marital assets are properly protected during what appears to be a period of emotional and financial instability on your part. I'm calling my lawyer right now. This won't stand in court." "Feel free, though you might want to check your retainer agreement first. Most firms require payment before proceeding with litigation. The silence told me I'd hit my mark. "What do you want?" he finally asked, defeat creeping into his voice. "Meet me at Oriole at 1 o'clock. Come alone. Vanessa. Can entertain herself for a few hours. Unless you'd prefer to continue this financial review indefinitely." He sighed heavily. "Fine. Oriole at 1. After hanging up, I forwarded the call recording to my legal team with a brief note. Documentation of verbal acknowledgement of affair and new debt. Add to file. Elise arrived at 11, bringing with her the comprehensive forensic accounting report we'd commissioned on Richard's business. "It's worse than we thought," she said, spreading documents across my dining table. "Davenport Marketing has been hemorrhaging clients for the past year. He's been keeping up appearances by using personal funds to cover payroll and office expenses." I scanned the figures, noting the steep downward trajectory. And no one questioned why a supposedly successful marketing firm needed constant cash. Infusions? That's the interesting part. Elise pointed to a series of bank transfers. He's been disguising the personal contributions as client retainers from shell companies. On paper, it looks like new business coming in. How much has he put in? Nearly $430,000 since January. Most of it from the money you gave him to clear his previous debts. I shook my head, the full picture becoming clearer. So, he took my money, pretended his business was thriving, while actually using it to prop up a failing company just long enough to file for divorce and claim half of my assets. Exactly. Elise's expression hardened. There's more. The forensic accountants found evidence he's been preparing for this divorce for at least 8 months. He's been systematically documenting every contribution you've made to joint expenses, building a case for financial commingling to strengthen his claim on your separate property. The betrayal shouldn't have stung after everything else, but somehow it did. While I was paying off his debts and believing his promises of a fresh start, he'd been methodically plotting to take half of everything I owned. Did they find evidence of the affair in the business records? Elise smiled thinly. Vanessa Keller has received 3 performance bonuses in the past 4 months, totaling $47,000. The approval documentation includes overnight trips categorized as client development excursions, using company funds to finance his affair. I stood, gathering the documents. Perfect. Have copies of everything sent to Curtis. I want these details incorporated into Phase 2. Oriole was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived. Richard was already seated at a corner table, his usual confidence noticeably diminished. The crisp suit he'd worn yesterday was slightly rumpled, his expression harried as he checked his phone repeatedly. Money troubles? I asked pleasantly, taking the seat across from him. He glanced up, anger flashing briefly before he controlled it. Very funny. Can we please end this farce now? I have vendors threatening to cut services, employees waiting for paychecks, and a hotel room I can't pay for. Sounds stressful. I signaled for the waiter. I'll have the salmon and a glass of the Sancerre. Richard stared incredulously as I ordered. Are you serious right now? I'm in the middle of a financial crisis you created and you're ordering lunch? I never skip meals during negotiations. It clouds judgment. I looked up at the hovering waiter. He'll have the steak. Medium rare, if I recall correctly? Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly to the waiter. Once we were alone, he leaned forward. What negotiations? What do you want from me? It's quite simple. I want you to drop your divorce petition and sign a post-nuptial agreement that my lawyers have prepared. He scoffed. So you can divorce me later on your terms? No chance. Actually, the agreement includes a provision that I cannot file for. Divorce for at least 1 year from signing. It gives us both time to reconsider our positions. Suspicion darkened his features. What else does this agreement say? It acknowledges that my family's company, all inherited assets, and the apartment are my separate property. It establishes that any financial contributions I've made to your business were loans, not investments. And it requires financial transparency, moving forward with regular reviews by an independent accountant. So everything is yours, and I get nothing. He shook his head. That's not a negotiation, it's a surrender. Not quite. Our wine arrived, and I took a deliberate sip before continuing. In exchange, First Metropolitan Bank will immediately release your accounts and credit lines. Your business line of credit will be restored and even increased to help with current cash flow issues. And all negative reporting to credit agencies will be withdrawn. Richard's expression shifted as he calculated his options. And if I refuse? Then the bank continues its review indefinitely. Your business accounts remain frozen. Your credit score, already damaged from the previous debts I paid, takes another hit. Your clients lose confidence when vendors stop services. And your employees, including Vanessa, miss multiple paychecks. He took a long drink of his wine. How did you do it? There's no way you influenced a major bank overnight. That's not relevant to our current discussion. It is to me. His eyes narrowed. You said you know everything about my business. What else have you been doing behind my back? I smiled thinly. Protecting my interests, just as you've been protecting yours. The difference is I've been more effective. Our food arrived, and I began eating as if we were having a pleasant lunch between colleagues. Richard stared at his untouched steak. "I can't sign anything without my lawyer reviewing it," he finally said. "Of course. I've taken the liberty of having your current retainer paid in full." I removed an envelope from my purse and slid it across the table. "This contains a cashier's check for $10,000 made out to James Harrington at Silverman Associates. Sufficient to cover immediate legal consultation." Richard's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected move. "Why would you pay my lawyer?" "I want you properly represented. It strengthens the agreement against future challenges." He studied me with new wariness. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I've had time to consider my position while you were busy with other pursuits." Richard cut into his steak, finally taking a bite as he continued to assess the situation. "Even if I wanted to sign this agreement, what about Vanessa? My relationship with her is serious. Your personal life is your own concern, provided it doesn't impact our financial arrangements. The postnuptial simply requires us to remain legally married for 12 months. It doesn't dictate living arrangements or personal relationships." "You'd let me stay with her while still married to you?" Disbelief colored his voice. "As I said, your personal choices are yours to make. My interest is in protecting my assets and ensuring an orderly resolution to our situation." He put down his fork, studying me. "This isn't like you, Alex. The freezing accounts, the calculated moves. You've changed." "No, Richard. I've simply stopped pretending to be someone I'm not." I met his gaze steadily. "You married Alexandra Pierce, CFO of Pierce Financials, not the accommodating wife you tried to shape me into. Consider this a reintroduction to the woman you actually married." Something like respect flickered in his eyes, quickly replaced by calculation. "And after the 12 months? What then?" "Then we reassess. Either we find a way forward together, or we separate under terms that reflect our actual contributions to the marriage. Meaning, you get everything. Meaning you don't get rewarded for betrayal." Richard fell silent, weighing his limited options. His phone buzzed several times in quick succession, and his expression tightened as he checked the messages. "Problem?" I inquired politely. "My office landlord just emailed. Our rent payment was rejected. They're threatening to change the locks on Monday." He looked up, defeated. "When would the accounts be unfrozen if I sign?" "The moment the signed agreement is filed with the court. Within hours for your personal accounts, by close of business. Tomorrow for the business accounts." He drained his wine glass. "And you guarantee the business line of credit will be restored?" "With a 20% increase in the limit, as I mentioned. First Metropolitan is quite accommodating once they complete their security reviews." Richard stared out the window for a long moment, then turned back to me. "I need to speak with my lawyer first, and I want 24 hours to consider after that." "You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow. After that, First Metropolitan's review process enters a secondary phase that could extend the holds for up to 30 days. He flinched visibly at the timeline. "You're really going to destroy everything I've built if I don't sign?" "I'm not destroying anything, Richard. I'm simply allowing natural consequences to unfold. Your business is failing because of your mismanagement. Your credit is in jeopardy because of your reckless spending. I'm offering a lifeline, not causing the initial problem." The waiter approached with the dessert menu, but Richard waved him away. "I've lost my appetite. I need to call my lawyer." "Of course." I signaled for the check. "One more thing. Tell Vanessa that her position at Davenport marketing is secure, regardless of your decision. I have no desire to punish employees for their boss's failings." Richard's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Why would you care about Vanessa's job?" "I don't. But I do believe in separating business from personal matters, a distinction you might want to consider in the future." As Richard left to make his calls, I remained at the table, finishing my wine. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Phase 2 was unfolding perfectly. Back at my apartment, I found Elise waiting with Curtis Richardson. The banking executive rose as I entered, his expression serious. "Richard's already called the bank 3 times since your lunch," he reported. "He's demanding to speak with the review department and threatening legal action." "As expected," I replied, setting down my purse. "Has he contacted his lawyer?" Elise nodded, checking her tablet. "Called immediately after leaving the restaurant. They spoke for 43 minutes. And? Our source at Silverman reports that Harrington advised him to sign the post-nup. Apparently, he told Richard that given the circumstances, it's the best option to salvage his business and reputation." I smiled. James Harrington's reputation as a shark in divorce proceedings was well earned, but even sharks recognized when their clients were outmaneuvered. "What's our next step?" Curtis asked. "Now we wait." I moved to the window, looking out at the city bathed in afternoon light. Richard needs to believe this is his decision, a difficult but necessary compromise. "And if he refuses?" Elise asked. "He won't." I turned back to them. Richard's greatest weakness has always been his fear of public failure. He'll sign to save face, to keep his employees from knowing how close to collapse his company truly is. Curtis nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of his company, I've prepared the documentation for Phase 3, should we need to proceed." "Excellent." I accepted the folder he offered, scanning the contents. These loan restructuring terms are perfect, generous enough to appear as a legitimate banking accommodation, but with carefully crafted default triggers. "The covenants are particularly tailored," he agreed. "Any significant shift in business operations, attempt to sell assets, or change in executive leadership would constitute a default event, essentially locking him into running his failing business exactly as he has been," Elise observed with a thin smile. "Unless he makes substantive improvements," I corrected. "The agreement doesn't prevent success. It merely ensures he can't escape responsibility." My phone chimed with a text from Richard. "Harrington reviewing agreement now. Need to discuss modifications." I showed the message to Elise, who raised an eyebrow. "Modifications? That's optimistic of him." "He's testing boundaries," I replied, typing a response. "Minor adjustments possible. Major changes unacceptable." Curtis checked his watch. "I should return to the bank. The automated notifications for his corporate vendors are set to deploy at 4 p.m. unless countermanded." "Let them proceed," I decided. Pressure ensures compliance. After Curtis departed, Elise and I spent the next hour reviewing the forensic accounting report in greater detail. Richard's business practices revealed a pattern of short-term thinking that had gradually eroded his company's foundation. Inflated projections to attract clients, discounted rates that barely covered costs, extravagant entertainment expenses that yielded minimal returns. "It's almost sad," Elise commented, closing the file. "He had genuine talent when you met him. His early campaigns were innovative." "Success changed him," I replied. "Or perhaps revealed him. Either way, he chose this path." My phone rang. Richard. Again. "Yes?" "Harrington has concerns about the non-divorce provision," he said without preamble. "Says it might not be enforceable in New York State." "It's not a prohibition on divorce," I clarified. "It's a financial penalty provision. You can file any time, but doing so within 12 months triggers immediate repayment of all outstanding loans and credit lines." He was silent for a moment. "That wasn't clear in the draft. It's in Section 12, Paragraph 3. Perhaps your lawyer should read more carefully." Richard's frustration was audible. "We have other concerns as well. The financial transparency requirements are excessive. Monthly reviews by your chosen accountant, an independent accountant, mutually agreed upon," I corrected. "Whatever." "It's intrusive and unnecessary. Would you prefer continued account freezes? Because those are your options, Richard. Financial transparency or financial paralysis." Another pause. "This feels like blackmail." "It's accountability. Something you've skillfully avoided for years." "Fine." His voice hardened. But we want a mutual non-disparagement clause. No public discussions of our marital issues from either party. That was actually a reasonable request. Acceptable. Have Harrington draft the language. And I want a guarantee that my business line of credit remains available for the full 12 months, regardless of any performance reviews the bank might conduct. Provided all payments are made on time and no covenants are breached, yes. Richard sighed heavily. This isn't how I wanted things to go, Alex. And yet here we are. I did love you, you know. At the beginning. Fascinating how love correlates with financial convenience in your worldview. I kept my tone neutral, despite the unexpected twist toward sentimentality. Will that be all? I have a meeting in 30 minutes. Harrington will send the revised agreement by 6 p.m. We want signatures tomorrow morning, not afternoon. A.m. at my lawyer's office, I agreed. But Richard? The account holds will remain in place until the signed agreement is filed with the court. No exceptions. After hanging up, I turned to find Elise watching me with concern. You okay? It's never easy when they try the emotional approach. I'm fine. I busied myself gathering the documents scattered across the table. His timing is predictable. When logic fails, try sentiment. He's desperate, she agreed. The notifications to his vendors just went out. My contact at his office says the internet provider called threatening immediate service termination for non-payment. I nodded, unsurprised. Have your contact monitor the situation. I want to know exactly how Richard handles this with his staff. Already arranged. She'll text updates throughout the evening. As evening fell, the reports began flowing in. Richard had called an emergency staff meeting, claiming a temporary banking issue was causing payment delays. He'd personally guaranteed that everything would be resolved by tomorrow. Employee reactions had ranged from skeptical to alarmed, with several updating their resumes during the meeting itself. Vanessa had remained silent throughout, then followed Richard into his office for a private conversation that had quickly escalated into an argument audible through the closed door. Words like ruined and promised me had featured prominently. By 8 p.m., Richard had texted me again. Agreement changes sent to your lawyer. I'll sign tomorrow as agreed. Now please tell the bank to stop sending cancellation notices to every damn vendor I work with. I replied simply, 9 a.m. Don't be late. At precisely 8:45 the next morning, I arrived at my lawyer's office in Midtown. Barbara Chen, who had handled my family's legal matters for 15 years, greeted me with her characteristic efficiency. The revised agreement arrived last night, she confirmed, leading me to her spacious corner office overlooking Bryant Park. Their changes were minimal and acceptable. I've incorporated them into the final document. And the filing preparation? Ready to submit electronically the moment both signatures are notarized. I've alerted the court clerk to expect it. I nodded, satisfied with her thoroughness. And Curtis? On standby. The moment the filing confirmation comes through, he'll initiate the account releases. We spent the next few minutes reviewing the final document. The post-nuptial agreement ran to 47 pages, its language precise and comprehensive. Every asset was categorized, every financial responsibility detailed, every contingency addressed. It was, as Barbara described it, divorce-proof. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from the reception desk. Richard had arrived. Show him in, I instructed Barbara, taking a seat at the conference table. It's time to conclude phase 2. Richard entered moments later, James Harrington at his side. Both men looked like they'd had a difficult night. Richard's usual polish was noticeably absent, and Harrington's expression was grimly professional. Good morning, gentlemen, Barbara greeted them. Shall we proceed directly to the agreement? Let's, Harrington replied tersely. My client has reviewed the final revisions and is prepared to sign, contingent upon immediate release of the banking holds. Of course. Barbara slid copies of the agreement across the table. As you can see, we've incorporated all your requested changes. The mutual non-disparagement clause is in Section 7, and the credit line guarantees are detailed in Appendix C. Richard flipped directly to the signature pages. I don't need to read it again. Where do I sign? Richard, Harrington cautioned. We should review once more before— It's fine, James. I trust your review. Richard's voice was flat with resignation. Let's just get this over with. I watched silently as he signed each flagged page, his signature growing progressively less precise with each iteration. When he reached the final page, he paused, pen hovering above the line. When will the accounts be unfrozen? He asked, looking directly at me for the first time since entering. The moment the court confirms receipt of the filed agreement, I replied, approximately 30 minutes after we finish here. He nodded once, then signed with a decisive stroke. There. Satisfied? It's not about satisfaction, Richard. It's about protection. As the notary processed the documents, Richard's phone buzzed repeatedly. He checked it with a grimace. Vendors? I inquired politely. And employees. Everyone wants to know when they'll be paid. He looked up, a flash of his old confidence returning. But that's about to be resolved, isn't it? Indeed. Barbara's assistant entered with confirmation that the agreement had been successfully filed. The court has accepted the document. Filing number confirmed. I immediately texted Curtis. Agreement filed. Proceed with account releases. Within minutes, Richard's phone chimed with banking notifications. His expression shifted as he scrolled through the messages. Access restored, he confirmed, a mixture of relief and lingering resentment in his voice. And the business line? Check your business account, I suggested. He tapped his screen and his eyebrows rose slightly. The credit line is increased, as promised. I always keep my word, Richard. Something you might consider adopting. Harrington gathered his papers, clearly eager to conclude the meeting. If that's all, we should be going. My client has a business to salvage. Of course. Barbara rose, extending her hand professionally. We'll be in touch regarding the monthly financial reviews. The first is scheduled for April 15th. As they turned to leave, I called out, Richard, one moment. He paused at the door, wariness evident, in his stance. The next 12 months don't have to be adversarial, I said. We both have what we need now. You have your business and financial stability. I have protection for my assets. He studied me, suspicion gradually giving way to cautious relief. So that's it? We just coexist for a year? Unless you'd prefer to attempt reconciliation. I kept my tone deliberately neutral. Something like regret flickered across his features. I don't think that's possible anymore. Probably not, I agreed. But the option exists, should circumstances change. Richard nodded slowly. Thank you for the business line increase. It will help with the immediate cash flow issues. Consider it an investment in an orderly transition. After they departed, Barbara turned to me with a raised eyebrow. That was almost conciliatory. Having second thoughts? Not at all. I gathered my belongings, checking my watch. Phase 2 is complete. Richard believes he's weathered the crisis, secured his business, and established a workable if restrictive arrangement. And the reality? I smiled thinly. Phase 3 begins this afternoon. As I left the office, my phone buzzed with a text from Elise. Board meeting confirmed for 2 p.m. Preston Holdings representatives will attend. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Richard had just signed away more than he realized. His momentary relief would soon give way to the dawning realization that financial access was only the beginning of what I now controlled. The real leverage had just been secured, and he had signed it into legal enforceability himself. Richard believed he had 12 months to rebuild his business and prepare for our eventual divorce. In reality, He had exactly 21 days before Phase 3 would irrevocably alter the equation once again. The Pierce Financial's boardroom exuded quiet, power. Mahogany tables, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan created the perfect backdrop for decisions that affected millions of dollars daily. Today would be no exception. I sat at the head of the table, tablet open before me, as members of the executive team and representatives from Preston Holdings filed in. Elise took her place to my right, while Marcus Preston seated himself to my left. Curtis Richardson chose a seat slightly removed from the main group, maintaining the appearance of professional distance that our arrangement required. "Shall we begin?" I asked once everyone was settled. Elise distributed digital packets to all attendees with a few taps on her device. "Operation Phoenix, Phase 3, she announced. "All preliminary steps are complete." Marcus nodded approvingly. "The post-nuptial agreement has been filed and confirmed." "Excellent work, Alexandra." "Richard believes he's secured a reprieve," I replied. "His accounts are unfrozen, his credit lines restored. From his perspective, he's weathered the crisis." "And from our perspective?" Curtis asked. I swiped to the next page of my presentation. Phase 3 represents the substantive restructuring of Davenport Marketing Solutions. As of this morning, First Metropolitan Bank holds senior secured debt against all company assets. The EI. Post-nuptial agreement Richard signed included clauses that convert all my previous investments in his business to formal loans with specific performance requirements. "Loans that are now owned by First Metropolitan," Curtis added for clarity. "Precisely." I displayed the company's financial statements on the main screen. Davenport Marketing currently has negative cash flow, declining revenues, and operates primarily through the expanded credit line we just provided. Their client retention rate has fallen to 62% over the past 2 quarters. "In other words," Elise interjected, "they're a company in crisis, temporarily stabilized by our intervention." Marcus studied the projections thoughtfully. "The loan covenants require monthly performance reviews and maintenance of specific financial ratios, correct?" "Yes," Curtis confirmed. "Based on current trajectories, they'll violate at least 3 covenants within 21 days." The plan's elegance wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Richard had signed an agreement he believed would simply protect my personal assets while allowing him operational freedom. In reality, he'd placed his entire company under our control, with triggers we could activate whenever we chose. "Once they breach the covenants," I continued, "First Metropolitan will have the right to appoint a financial advisor with operational oversight. That's where Preston Holdings enters officially." Marcus outlined the next steps. "We've identified 3 potential candidates for the advisor role. All experienced marketing executives with turnaround expertise. Once appointed, they'll have authority to review all client contract, staffing decisions, and spending." "How will Richard respond?" one of the executives asked. "With anger initially," I predicted. "Then pragmatism. The agreement gives him no recourse except compliance or bankruptcy, and Richard's ego won't allow him to declare bankruptcy." "What about this Vanessa person?" someone asked. "She's still in the picture?" Elise pulled up an employee file. "Vanessa Keller, 29, Vice President of Client Relations. With the company for 3 years, promoted twice in unusual circumstances. Her professional background is limited for her current position, meaning she slept her way to the top," Marcus observed dryly. "Her performance reviews, conducted by Richard personally, cite exceptional client management skills and outstanding commitment to after-hours client development," Elise continued with barely concealed disdain. I redirected the conversation. "Vanessa is actually useful to us in Phase 3. Richard's relationship with her creates predictable behavior patterns we can leverage." Curtis raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "According to our sources, Richard has promised Vanessa a significant future with both him and the company. He's emotionally and professionally invested in maintaining her status and lifestyle. This creates additional pressure points beyond his own needs." meaning he'll fight harder to preserve appearances, Marcus concluded. Exactly. And fighting. Harder means making more mistakes. I changed the display to a timeline. The 21-day window gives us time to place our monitoring systems. Elise's contact inside Davenport Marketing will provide daily reports on Richard's activities. First, Metropolitan will track every transaction through both business and personal accounts. And the objective remains the same? Curtis confirmed. Financial control, not destruction? Correct. I don't want to destroy Davenport Marketing. It employs 37 people who've done nothing wrong. The goal is transformation, removing the cancerous leadership while preserving the viable parts of the organization. The meeting continued for another hour as we refined the details of Phase 3. Each team member received specific assignments, timeframes, and reporting requirements. By the time we adjourned, the machinery was in motion for the next stage of Richard's reckoning. As the others filed out, Marcus lingered. Your approach is remarkably measured, Alexandra. Many in your position would simply burn everything to the ground. Revenge through destruction is fleeting, I replied, gathering my materials. Revenge through transformation is enduring. He nodded thoughtfully. Edward was right about you. You understand the long game. Speaking of Edward, please convey my thanks for his assistance. Without his introduction to Curtis, none of this would have been possible. He's following your progress with great interest, Marcus smiled. I believe his exact words were, she's making an art form of justified retribution. After the meeting, Elise and I returned to my apartment to monitor the immediate aftermath of the post-nuptial signing. Our sources reported that Richard had returned to his office triumphant, announcing to his staff that all financial issues had been resolved. He'd authorized immediate payment of outstanding invoices and scheduled a champagne celebration for the afternoon. He genuinely believes he's won, Elise observed, reviewing the surveillance report. Or at least achieved a stalemate. His perspective is limited to the immediate crisis, I replied. That's always been Richard's weakness, solving today's problem while creating tomorrow's disaster. My phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen, surprised to see Richard's name. He's calling me. That's unexpected. Elise raised an eyebrow. Want me to leave? No. Stay. I accepted the call, putting it on speaker. Yes, Richard? Alex. His tone was strangely conciliatory. I just wanted to... Well, thank you for acting so quickly with the accounts. Everything's working properly now. I exchanged a puzzled glance with Elise. You're welcome. Though I merely kept my end of our agreement. I know. Still, you could have dragged things out to punish me further. A pause. I'm having the team put together a proper expense report for the bank's monthly review. Figured it would be smart to start on the right foot. Now I understood. Richard was attempting to establish a cooperative relationship to soften the oversight requirements. A predictable strategy, but surprising in its immediacy. That's wise, I replied neutrally. The first review will establish the baseline for future evaluations. Right? Exactly. Another pause. Listen, I was thinking, maybe we could meet occasionally to discuss how this arrangement is working, without lawyers, just to make sure we're both getting what we need from the situation. Elise rolled her eyes dramatically. I don't think that's necessary, I said. The agreement is quite explicit, and the banking relationship is now formalized. Regular meetings would only complicate matters. It doesn't have to be complicated. Alex, his voice softened into the persuasive tone he used with difficult clients. We were married for 12 years. Surely we can have civil conversations about mutual interests. Our interests diverged the moment you began an affair while plotting to claim half my assets, Richard. The post-nuptial creates a functional framework. For the next 12 months, I suggest we operate within that framework without unnecessary elaboration. His tone chilled immediately. Fine, have it your way. I was trying to be reasonable. No, you were attempting to establish informal channels to later circumvent formal requirements. It's a negotiation tactic you've used for years. A sharp laugh. You really have changed, Alex. Or maybe you were always this calculating and I just never noticed. Perhaps you were too busy calculating your own advantages to pay attention. After he hung up, Elise shook her head admiringly. He's still trying to manipulate you. Of course. It's his default setting. I placed my phone on the coffee table. But it's informative that he's attempting reconciliation so quickly. It suggests he's more concerned about the oversight provisions than he let on during negotiations. He should be, Elise replied, pulling up the dashboard showing Richard's business accounts. Look at today's transactions. Since regaining access this morning, he's transferred $78,000 to various vendors, paid $127,000 in overdue payroll, and moved $50,000 to a business development account that didn't exist last week. I studied the transaction list. The new account is interesting. Flag it for additional monitoring. Already done. Curtis has arranged for special scrutiny on any account created after the agreement was signed. The next week passed in a flurry of activity as we implemented the monitoring infrastructure for Phase 3. Richard, meanwhile, appeared to be on a spending spree to stabilize his business and reassure his remaining clients. Daily reports from Elise's inside source indicated frantic activity at Davenport Marketing, emergency client meetings, rushed completion of overdue projects, and mandatory weekend work sessions for all staff. He's burning through the credit line at an unsustainable rate, Curtis reported during our weekly update. At current spending levels, he'll exhaust the additional funding within 15 days. Perfect timing, I noted, just before the covenant review. There's more, Elise added, consulting her tablet. He's personally meeting with every major client, promising expanded services and faster deliverables. He's essentially committing to work his team can't possibly execute on schedule. Setting himself up for client disappointments and potential contract breaches, I concluded. Any movement on the mysterious business development account? Curtis nodded. Regular transfers? To a company called Vision Forward Consulting. On paper, they're providing strategic advisory services to Davenport Marketing. In reality, Vision Forward was incorporated 3 weeks ago with Vanessa Keller listed as the principal. I wasn't surprised. He's funneling money to her through a shell company. Precisely. $12,000 transferred so far for unspecified consulting services. Does this violate any loan covenants? I asked. Not technically, Curtis admitted. The amounts are just below the threshold for related party transaction disclosures, but it does demonstrate intent to circumvent the spirit of the oversight provisions. Document everything, I instructed. When we activate Phase 3, these transactions will form part of the justification for intervention. On day 14 after the agreement signing, our surveillance detected a significant development. Richard had scheduled confidential interviews with 3 marketing executives from competing firms. The pattern suggested he was considering bringing in senior talent to strengthen his leadership team. Smart move, Marcus commented when I shared the information. If he can bring in established professionals with strong client relationships, he might actually stabilize the business. Except he can't afford them, Elise pointed out. The salary. Expectations for executives of that caliber would exceed his current budget by at least 30%. Unless he's planning to offer equity instead of salary, I mused, which would dilute his ownership. Curtis shook his head. The loan covenants explicitly prohibit any change in ownership structure without bank approval. He'd need First Metropolitan's permission to issue new shares. Which we wouldn't grant, Marcus concluded. Not necessarily, I countered, an idea forming. If he presents a candidate who genuinely strengthens the company, approving an ownership change could serve our long-term objectives. They looked at me questioningly. Think about it, I explained. Our goal isn't to destroy Davenport Marketing, but to transform it. If Richard brings in legitimate talent that improves the company's prospects, that's actually aligned with our interests. But it would help Richard maintain control, Elise objected. In the short term, yes. But it would also create another stakeholder with voting rights, someone who's financially motivated to challenge Richard's poor decisions. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning. You're thinking of the long game. A professional executive with equity would become a natural ally once they realize Richard's leadership is the primary obstacle to success. Exactly. An inside change agent we don't have to recruit or control. We decided to monitor the executive interviews closely, but not interfere. If Richard made a strong hire, we would consider approving the equity arrangement with specific conditions that further reinforced our oversight. Day 17 brought an unexpected complication. Vanessa Keller resigned from Davenport Marketing without notice, effective immediately. Our inside source reported a massive argument behind closed doors, with shouting audible throughout the office. She had departed with her personal belongings, leaving Richard visibly shaken. What triggered it? I asked Elise, who was reviewing the surveillance reports. Apparently, Richard informed her that their Chicago trip next week would need to be downgraded from 5-star accommodations to something more modest. The bank's oversight requirements were mentioned. I smiled slightly. She didn't appreciate the lifestyle adjustment. Evidently not. According to our source, she accused him of breaking promises about her future role and compensation. Is she completely out of the picture? Elise tapped through several screens on her tablet. Financial transactions suggest otherwise. He sent $15,000 from his personal account to Vision Forward Consulting this morning, labeled as final consulting payment. A parting gift? Or payment to keep quiet about something? Unclear. But there's more. Elise pulled up a real estate listing. This 2-bedroom condo in Soho was purchased 3 weeks ago by a shell company connected to Richard. Guess who moved in yesterday? The sleek apartment featured exposed brick walls, industrial chic design, and a terrace with downtown views. Exactly the type of place that would appeal to someone like Vanessa. He bought her an apartment, I stated flatly, while crying poverty to his employees and vendors. The purchase price was $1.7 million. The down payment came from the funds you provided to clear his debts. The revelation should have hurt. Instead, it merely confirmed what I already knew about Richard's character. He would always prioritize his personal desires over business responsibilities or ethical considerations. This actually helps us, I decided after considering the implications. The condo purchase creates another financial pressure point we can leverage in Phase 3. How so? Elise asked. If the property is owned by a shell company rather than Richard personally, it constitutes a business asset that falls under the bank's security agreement. First Metropolitan could potentially claim an interest in it during covenant enforcement. Elise's eyes widened. You would take Vanessa's apartment? Not to keep it, I clarified, but to force disclosure of how it was purchased and where the funds originated. If Richard used business resources to buy a residence for his girlfriend, that's a clear breach of fiduciary duty. On day 19, 2 days before the scheduled covenant review, Richard made his move with the executive recruitment. He extended an offer to Catherine Morrison, a well-respected marketing strategist who had previously led digital transformation at a major competitor. The compensation package included both salary and a 15% equity stake, contingent upon bank approval. Morrison is actually an excellent choice, Marcus acknowledged when we reviewed her credentials. Harvard MBA, digital native, strong client relationships in sectors where Davenport is weakest. Her reputation is sterling, Curtis agreed. If anyone could help turn the company around, she'd be on the short list. I studied Morrison's profile thoughtfully. What would motivate someone of her caliber to join a struggling firm like Davenport Marketing? The equity, Elise suggested. In a better-run version of the company, 15% could be quite valuable. Or the challenge, Marcus offered. Some executives are attraction to turnaround situations. It's a chance to make your mark quickly. Either way, I concluded, she represents a positive development for the company itself, if not for Richard. Personally, I think we should approve the equity issuance but with conditions. What conditions? Curtis asked. First, Morrison receives a board seat with full voting rights on all major company decisions. Second, her equity vests over 3 years rather than immediately. Third, First Metropolitan reserves the right to appoint an independent director to maintain oversight. Marcus smiled appreciatively. Those terms transform her from merely Richard's hire to a potential check on his authority. Exactly. And they're all justifiable as standard bank protections when approving significant ownership. Changes in a borrower. Curtis made notes on his tablet. I'll prepare the approval documentation with these conditions. Should we communicate directly with Morrison? Not yet, I decided. Let Richard present our conditions. If she accepts, then we can establish a direct relationship during the formal approval process. The 21st day arrived, the first formal covenant review under the postnuptial agreement. First Metropolitan's detailed analysis showed what we already knew. Davenport Marketing had violated 3 separate covenants despite the increased credit line. The debt-to-EBITDA ratio exceeded maximum thresholds by 22%. Working capital had fallen below required minimums. The company had entered into unauthorized related party transactions, the payments to Vision Forward Consulting. Curtis officially notified Richard of the violations that morning, triggering the bank's right to appoint a financial advisor with operational oversight. Simultaneously, Preston Holdings activated the final component of Phase 3, the advisor selection process. Richard is demanding a meeting, Elise reported, checking her messages. He's claiming the covenant calculations are incorrect and threatening to bring in his own auditors. A predictable first response, I noted calmly. Curtis should schedule the meeting for tomorrow morning at First Metropolitan. That gives Richard time to consult with his financial team and recognize the violations are real. Should you attend? Marcus asked. I shook my head. My involvement remains confidential. As far as Richard knows, this is standard bank procedure following covenant violations. By evening, Richard's tone had changed from defiance to negotiation. He'd acknowledged the violations but requested a 30-day cure period before implementation of enhanced oversight. Curtis denied the request politely but firmly, citing the clear terms of the loan agreements. He's also withdrawn the offer to Catherine Morrison, Elise reported, checking the latest surveillance update. Apparently, he told her the timing wasn't right due to temporary financial restructuring. Unfortunate but expected, I replied. He won't want another strong voice in the room while dealing with the bank's intervention. The following morning, Richard met with Curtis and the bank's loan workout team. The meeting lasted 3 hours, during which Richard cycled through anger, bargaining, and finally resignation as the reality of his situation became clear. He tried everything, Curtis reported afterward. Threatened litigation, offered accelerated payments, even suggested personal guarantees from wealthy investor friends who don't actually exist. When none of that worked, he finally asked what terms we would accept. And you presented our prepared options? Yes. Option A. The bank appoints a financial advisor with full operational oversight, while Richard remains CEO with restricted authority. Option B. Richard voluntarily steps back to a chief marketing officer role, while the bank brings in an interim CEO for restructuring. His choice? I asked. Option A, as expected. His ego wouldn't allow him to relinquish the CEO title, even with diminished authority. I nodded, satisfied with the outcome. Then we proceed with the advisor appointment. Has Marcus selected the candidate? Yes. Jonathan Wells, former CFO of Grayson Media Group, 20 years of experience, specializing in digital marketing company turnarounds. No previous connection to Richard or Davenport Marketing. Perfect. When does he start? Monday morning. Richard has the weekend to prepare his team for the bank-mandated oversight. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Phase 3 had successfully transferred effective control of Davenport marketing to our chosen representative, all while maintaining the fiction that this was standard bank procedure rather than my orchestrated revenge. The weekend brought predictable developments. Richard sent a series of increasingly desperate texts, attempting to reopen negotiations about the advisor arrangement. Each message revealed a man struggling to maintain the appearance of control while watching his authority evaporate. "Alex, this bank situation is ridiculous. They're essentially taking over my company over minor technical violations. Can we talk? The advisor they're sending is completely unreasonable. He's demanding access to all client files and employee records. This is going to damage client relationships. If this is your doing somehow, you've made your point. Let's find a compromise that doesn't destroy everything I've built." I didn't respond to any of them. There was nothing to be gained from engaging directly at this stage. Richard needed to experience the full impact of the intervention without my interference. Sunday evening, I received a more subdued message. "I know you're behind this somehow. I don't know how you influenced the bank, but this has your fingerprints all over it. I underestimated you. Can we please talk before this goes any further?" Again, I didn't respond. But I did forward the message to my legal team with instructions to document it as evidence of Richard's growing awareness of his situation. Monday morning arrived, Jonathan Wells's first day as financial advisor to Davenport Marketing. Elise and I monitored the situation from my apartment, receiving real-time updates from our inside source. Wells arrived at 8:30, Elise reported, reading from her tablet. Richard attempted to schedule a private meeting before the staff introduction, but Wells declined, saying he needed to address the entire team immediately. I smiled at the subtle power move. Wells understands his role perfectly. The all-hands meeting started at 9:15. Wells introduced himself as representing First Metropolitan's interests following covenant violations. He emphasized that his role was to stabilize the company, not to dismantle it. How did Richard handle it? Apparently, he stood silently at the back of the room, arms crossed. When Wells finished, Richard attempted to characterize the arrangement as a temporary partnership, but Wells immediately corrected him, clarifying that all significant decisions now require his approval. My phone buzzed with a call from Curtis. "You'll want to hear this," he said without preamble. Wells just discovered that Richard transferred $120,000 to a personal account on Friday after learning about the covenant violations. He's calling it an advance on deferred compensation, but there's no documentation supporting such an arrangement. "How is Wells handling it?" I asked. "He's frozen all remaining accounts and demanded immediate return of the funds. Richard is claiming he needs time to unwind the transaction." "Meaning he's already spent part of it," I concluded. "Has Wells threatened any consequences?" "Yes. He's informed Richard that failure to return the full amount by close of business constitutes grounds for immediate removal as CEO under the loan agreements." This was an unexpected acceleration, but not unwelcome. Richard's desperate grab for cash revealed his true character and provided perfect justification for the next phase of our plan. "Advise Wells to document everything meticulously, but hold off on removal proceedings until tomorrow," I instructed. "Give Richard one night to experience the full anxiety of potential termination." "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes. Have Wells schedule individual meetings with all department heads today. I want him to identify potential internal allies before making any move against Richard." By evening, the situation had developed further. Richard had returned $85,000 of the transferred funds, claiming the remainder had been used for urgent company business that he would document later. Wells had accepted the partial return, but maintained his position that full restitution was required to avoid CEO removal. "Our source says the office atmosphere is unbearably tense," Elise reported. Several employees were seen updating their resumes, and 2 client calls were canceled because Richard was unavailable throughout the afternoon. Where was he? I asked. Apparently, he left the office around 2 p.m. without explanation. Wells didn't attempt to stop him but did notify security to document his departure time. My phone buzzed with another text from Richard. This has gone too far. That advisor is destroying everything. If you have any influence with the bank, please call them off. I'll sign whatever you want. For the first time, I decided to respond. This is between you and First Metropolitan Bank. The consequences you're experiencing result from your own financial decisions. His reply came instantly. Bullshit. No bank appoints an advisor with this level of authority over minor covenant violations. You're behind this. I don't know how, but you are. I didn't confirm or deny, simply writing, perhaps you should focus on returning the misappropriated funds rather than assigning blame. No response followed. But 30 minutes later, Curtis called with an update. Richard just showed up at the bank, demanding to speak with senior management about Wells's authority. When refused, he claimed to have evidence of illegal collusion between you and First Metropolitan. Without any proof, I assume. Correct. Security escorted him out after he became verbally aggressive with the receptionist. The entire incident is on camera. Perfect. Another documented example of his instability under pressure. There's more, Curtis continued. He went directly from the bank to your apartment building. Security denied him entry, of course, but he spent 15 minutes in the lobby making increasingly agitated phone calls before leaving. I glanced at my security feed. Seeing the building's entrance was clear. Where is he now? Unknown. But his recent behavior suggests escalation. You may want to consider additional security precautions. I'll alert my building's security team to deny him entry under all circumstances. I agreed. And perhaps it's time to accelerate our timeline. What did you have in mind? I considered the situation carefully. Richard was unraveling faster than anticipated, creating both opportunity and risk. His erratic behavior provided justification for more dramatic intervention, but also increased the chances of unpredictable actions. Have Wells present Richard with an ultimatum tomorrow morning? Either step back voluntarily to a non-executive role with supervised access to clients, or face immediate removal proceedings based on today's documented misconduct. You think he'll agree to step back? No, his ego won't allow it. But the offer will be documented, demonstrating Wells's reasonable approach before taking more severe action. And when Richard refuses? Then Wells initiates formal removal as CEO, effective immediately, with security escort from the premises if necessary. That's aggressive, Curtis noted, though justified by recent events. The time for measured responses has passed. Richard has demonstrated he'll destroy the company rather than accept oversight. We need to move decisively to protect the business and the remaining employees. After ending the call, I gazed out at the city lights, contemplating how quickly the situation had evolved. When I'd conceived this plan months ago, I'd imagined a slower, more controlled dismantling of Richard's authority. Instead, his own actions were accelerating his downfall beyond my original timeline. Elise joined me at the window. Penny, for your thoughts? I'm considering the unpredictability of human behavior, I replied. No matter how carefully you plan, emotion often forces acceleration. Having second thoughts about Richard, I shook my head. Not at all, but I am reconsidering our approach to the employees. They're becoming collateral damage in this power struggle. What do you want to do? Let's prepare a stabilization plan. If Richard is removed tomorrow, there will be significant uncertainty among the staff. I want Wells ready with immediate reassurances about job security and client continuity. That's surprisingly compassionate, Elise observed. It's practical. The employees are the company's greatest asset. Preserving their confidence preserves the business value. My phone buzzed with an alert from building security. Richard had returned and was demanding entry, claiming a family emergency. Security had denied access per my instructions and threatened to call police if he didn't leave. Voluntarily. He's becoming desperate, Elise noted, reading the alert over my shoulder. And dangerous, I added. Tell security to document everything but avoid physical confrontation. If he refuses to leave, they should call police without engaging further. Another text appeared from Richard's personal number. I know you're home. We need to talk now. This is our company, our life. You can't just erase me. I showed Elise the message. Notice the shift from my company to our company. He's attempting to re-establish partnership now that he's losing control. Classic manipulation. She agreed. Are you going to respond? No. Any engagement would only encourage him. The plan proceeds tomorrow, regardless of his attempts to circumvent it. Security reported that Richard had finally left after 30 minutes of unsuccessful attempts to gain entry. His parting words to the doorman had been ominous. Tell her this isn't over. Not by a long shot. I forwarded the security report to my legal team with instructions to incorporate it into our documentation of Richard's increasingly erratic behavior. Then I contacted Wells to confirm tomorrow's strategy. I understand the plan, he assured me after I outlined the ultimatum approach. Present the step-back option first thing, document his refusal, then initiate formal removal with security present. Exactly. And immediately afterward, meet with department heads to reassure them about continuity. Emphasize that client work continues uninterrupted and jobs are secure during the transition. What about Davenport Marketing's name? Should I address that? I considered the question. The company name itself was part of Richard's identity and ego. Changing it would send a powerful message about the completeness of his removal. Suggests that a rebranding may be considered in the future, but it's not an immediate priority. Plant the seed without making it a focus of tomorrow's communications. Understood. And if Richard becomes physically confrontational? Security will handle removal if necessary. Your role is to maintain professional composure and focus on stabilizing the organization afterward. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how Phase 3 had evolved beyond its original design. What had been planned as a 3-month gradual diminishment of Richard's authority had compressed into a 3-week collapse. His own actions, the unauthorized transfer, the confrontations at the bank and my building, the threatened employees, had created the justification for his accelerated removal. Tomorrow would mark the effective end of Richard Davenport's control over the company that bore his name. He would be removed as CEO, escorted from the premises, his access credentials revoked, his company email disabled. The professional identity he'd cultivated for years would be stripped away in a single morning. Yet this wasn't the true culmination of my plan. Phase 3 would conclude with Richard's removal, but Phase 4, the final revelation, was still to come. That would be the moment Richard learned the full extent of my orchestration, the comprehensive nature of his defeat, and the permanent consequences of his betrayal. My phone buzzed one final time before I turned in for the night. Another text. From Richard. I figured it out. Pierce Financials somehow acquired First Metropolitan. That's how you're controlling everything. Tomorrow I'm going to expose the whole scheme. This ends now. He was getting closer to the truth, but still missing critical pieces. Let him make his accusations tomorrow. They would only add to the justification for his removal. I sent one final message to Wells before turning off my phone. Be prepared for Richard to make allegations about bank ownership and my involvement. Tomorrow, document everything he says. It will be useful later. Phase 3 would conclude more dramatically than planned, but the essential outcome remained the same. By this time tomorrow, Richard would be removed from power, his authority eliminated, his company under direct external control. And then, When he had nothing left to lose but his illusions, Phase 4 would begin. The moment of complete revelation, when Richard Davenport finally understood the true architect of his downfall. Morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline New York winter day that made the city skyline look etched against the blue. I watched the sunrise from my kitchen window, savoring my coffee as I mentally prepared for what would unfold in the coming hours. Today was the culmination of months of planning, Richard's final day as CEO of Davenport Marketing. My phone chimed with a text from Wells. In position. Security briefed. Legal present. Proceeding as discussed. I sent a simple reply. Confirmed. Elise arrived at 8, tablet in hand, already scrolling through overnight updates. Richard arrived at the office at 6:30 this morning. He's been frantically calling clients and removing files from the server. As expected, I replied. Wells? Arrived at 7:45 with security and legal counsel. He's monitoring the file activity but not intervening yet. Wants to document the behavior fully before confrontation. I nodded approvingly. Wells understood that Richard's desperate actions would only strengthen the case for his removal. Every deleted file, every panicked client call was being logged as evidence of his unfitness to lead. Richard has scheduled an all-staff meeting for 9 noir, Elise continued. Wells plans to intercept before it begins. The confrontation would happen within the hour. I moved to my study, activating the secure feed our technical team had established. On my monitor appeared a live view of the Davenport Marketing Conference Room, where employees were beginning to gather for Richard's meeting. At precisely 8:55, Wells entered the conference room followed by 2 security officers and a woman I recognized as Barbara Chen's associate from the legal team. Richard was at the front of the room, papers spread before him, his expression shifting from surprise to fury as he registered Wells's entrance. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Wells approached calmly, placing a document folder on the table. "Mr. Davenport, following yesterday's events and your failure to fully return misappropriated company funds, I'm here representing First Metropolitan Bank to present 2 options." The employees exchanged confused glances, clearly unaware of the full situation. "This isn't the time," Richard hissed, gesturing to his staff. "We're about to begin a confidential company meeting." "Actually, this takes precedence," Wells replied, his tone professionally neutral but firm. Option 1, you voluntarily step back to a non-executive role, retaining client relationships under supervision. Option 2, formal removal as CEO, effective immediately, based on documented violations of loan covenants and fiduciary duties. Murmurs spread through the room as employees processed the shocking development. Richard's face flushed dark red. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "You have no authority to—" "I have complete authority under Section 7 of the loan agreement you signed," Wells interrupted, sliding a document forward. "Your choice, Mr. Davenport. Non-executive role or immediate removal. You have 5 minutes to decide." Richard glanced frantically around the room, seeming to realize for the first time how public this confrontation had become. "Everyone out," he ordered his staff. "Give us the room. Now." After a moment's hesitation, the employees filed out, casting worried glances back as they left. Once the door closed, Richard's composure collapsed entirely. "This is her doing," he snarled, pounding his fist on the table. "Alexandra is behind all of this. I don't know how, but she's orchestrated this entire situation." Wells maintained his professional demeanor. "Mr. Davenport, I represent First Metropolitan Bank's interests following multiple covenant violations. Your personal disputes are irrelevant to this proceeding." "Bullshit," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "Alexandra somehow gained control of First Metropolitan. This is all part of her revenge scheme." "Your allegations are noted," Wells replied calmly. "Your decision, please. Non-executive role or removal." Richard paced the room, running his hands through his hair. This company bears my name. I built it from nothing. You can't just walk in and take it from me. The company that bears your name is in financial distress due to your mismanagement, Wells countered. The bank has both the right and responsibility to protect its collateral. I'm calling my lawyer, Richard declared, pulling out his phone. By all means, your 5 minutes begins when the call concludes. I watched Richard's expression as he spoke urgently with his attorney, his face transitioning from anger to disbelief to desperation. When he hung up, he looked shell-shocked. He says I have no legal grounds to prevent this, Richard admitted, his voice hollow. That the loan agreements give the bank this authority. Correct, Wells confirmed. Your decision? Richard seemed to deflate before my eyes, the realization of his powerlessness finally sinking in. I won't step back voluntarily. You'll have to remove me. I won't give Alexandra the satisfaction of seeing me surrender. Very well. Wells nodded to the legal representative, who stepped forward with another document. This notice confirms your removal as CEO of Davenport Marketing Solutions, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect personal belongings, after which your access to the premises will be permanently revoked. As the security officers moved toward him, Richard made one last desperate play. I demand to meet with Alexandra Pierce. Tell her if she wants to destroy everything I've built, she should have the courage to do it to my face. Wells didn't react to the mention of my name. Mr. Davenport, this is a bank matter. Any personal grievances should be addressed through appropriate legal channels. The feed continued as security escorted Richard to his office, where he haphazardly gathered photos and personal items into a cardboard box. His company phone, laptop, and access cards were surrendered and inventoried by the legal representative. Throughout the process, Richard alternated between stunned silence and bursts of angry accusations about my involvement. He's leaving the building, Elise reported, monitoring a separate feed. Security has confirmed his credentials are deactivated. I closed the video feed, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The primary phase of Richard's professional dismantling was complete. Now came the personal revelation that would finalize his understanding. Shall I tell Curtis to proceed with the letter? Elise asked. I nodded. Yes. Have it messengered to the plaza immediately. Richard will likely head there to regroup. The letter had been prepared weeks ago. A formal notification from First Metropolitan Bank explaining the connection between Pierce Financials, Preston Holdings, and the bank itself. It would end any uncertainty about who was behind Richard's downfall. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. It's from a burner phone, Elise said, checking her monitoring system. Likely Richard, I answered, putting it on speaker. Hello, Richard. So you already know it's me? He said, his voice ragged. Of course you do. You seem to know everything these days. How can I help you? I kept my tone neutral, professional. Drop the act, Alex. I know you're behind everything. Somehow you got to First Metropolitan, convinced them to appoint that attack dog Wells. I've just been publicly humiliated, thrown out of my own company. Are you satisfied now? Your removal was the result of documented financial misconduct. Richard, the misappropriated funds you failed to return were the final straw. He laughed bitterly. Still pretending this is just business? This is personal vengeance, pure and simple. I never thought you had it in you. Perhaps you never really knew me, I replied calmly. Just as I apparently never really knew you. What's that supposed to mean? It means I believed we were building a life together while you were plotting to take half of everything I owned. It means I paid off your debts believing your promises of change, while you were buying a $1.7 million condo for your girlfriend with those same funds. His sharp intake of breath told me he hadn't expected that level of detail. How did you know about the Soho apartment? Or the shell company you used to purchase it? Or the 3 failed business ventures you hid from me over the years? I let the questions hang for a moment. As I said, perhaps we never really knew each other. What do you want, Alex? You've taken my company, frozen my accounts, humiliated me professionally. What's your endgame here? A messenger will be delivering a letter to you shortly at the plaza, I informed him. It contains information that should answer your remaining questions. More legal threats? Haven't you done enough? Not threats, Richard. Simply clarity. Read it carefully. I ended the call and turned to Elise. How long until the messenger arrives? She checked her phone. 10 minutes at most. Curtis confirmed. The delivery is en route. Good. And the Phase 4 preparations? Complete, she confirmed. Edward Richardson has arranged the meeting for 3 p.m. today at his office. All participants are confirmed. The final phase was about to begin. The complete revelation of not just what I had done, but what would happen next. Richard believed today marked the end of his professional life. He had no idea it was merely the prelude to its transformation. Hour later, Curtis called. Letter delivered and signed for by Richard personally. His initial reaction was captured by our messenger's body camera. And, I prompted. Complete shock. He read the first paragraph explaining the ownership structure of First Metropolitan while standing in the hotel lobby. Apparently, he exclaimed, quite profanely before continuing to read. I smiled slightly. He's finally understanding the full picture. Indeed. The messenger reports he was still reading, seated in the lobby when she departed. His expression suggested increasing distress. With each page, the letter detailed how Pierce Financials had acquired controlling interest in First Metropolitan through Preston Holdings shortly after Richard initiated his affair with Vanessa. It explained that every financial decision, from the initial account freezes to today's CEO removal, had been orchestrated through a carefully constructed chain of legitimate banking procedures, all leading back to me. Any communication from him since receiving the letter? I asked. Not yet, Curtis replied. Though his phone shows multiple failed attempts to access our banking systems, each attempt is being logged as further evidence of his unstable behavior. Perfect. Keep monitoring and notify me immediately if he makes any significant movements. Richardson Tower presented a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in Richard's life. The sleek skyscraper housed Edward Richardson's private offices on the top floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Central Park blanketed in winter white. I arrived at 2:45, escorted immediately to Edward's private conference room. Marcus Preston was already there, along with Curtis and 3 individuals I recognized from photos as Catherine Morrison, Jonathan Wells, and Thomas Hargrove, the former CFO of Richard's largest competitor who had recently retired, Alexandra. Edward greeted me warmly, rising from his seat at the head of the table. The woman of the hour. Or perhaps the month, given what you've accomplished. Edward, I acknowledged with a nod. Thank you for arranging this gathering, my pleasure. Rarely do I get to witness such masterful corporate chess. He gestured to the others. Everyone here has been briefed on the situation and their potential roles moving forward. I took my seat, opening my portfolio. Then let's proceed. Directly to Phase 4, Catherine Morrison spoke first. To clarify, you're proposing a complete restructuring of Davenport marketing, rebranded under new leadership, with Richard Davenport potentially remaining in a strictly client-facing role? Correct, I confirmed. The company has viable client relationships and talented staff who shouldn't suffer for their CEO's failures. With proper leadership and financial stability, it could thrive. And my role would be? She inquired. CEO of the rebranded entity with complete operational control and an initial 30% equity stake. Wells would transition from bank advisor to CFO reporting to you. Hargrove would join as chairman, lending his industry reputation to restore client confidence. Thomas Hargrove stroked his silver beard thoughtfully. The brand damage from today's events will be significant. Davenport's name has become toxic in the industry within hours. Hence the immediate rebranding, I acknowledged. Announcing new leadership simultaneously with the name change would create a clear break from the past. And Richard? Wells asked. After what happened this morning, I find it difficult to imagine him accepting any subordinate position. He will when he understands. The alternative, I replied confidently. His choice will be simple: a respected client relationship role with the rebranded firm, or complete professional exile with all the financial consequences that entails. Edward chuckled softly. You've left him no viable alternative. Precisely. And the invitation to this meeting is his first indication that an alternative exists at all. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from building security. Richard had arrived and was being escorted up. He's here, I announced. Remember, this initial meeting is about presenting the framework, not negotiating details. Richard needs to understand this is his only path forward. The room fell silent as footsteps approached outside. Then the door opened, and Richard stood framed in the doorway, his appearance markedly different from the confident executive of just days ago. His suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from what appeared to be a combination of rage and sleeplessness. His gaze swept the room, widening as he recognized Catherine Morrison and Thomas Hargrove alongside the banking representatives who had orchestrated his removal. When his eyes finally landed on me, they narrowed with a mixture of fury and dawning comprehension. Welcome, Richard, Edward said smoothly, gesturing to the empty chair directly across from me. Please join us. We were just discussing the future of what was, until recently, your company. Richard remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. So this is it. The grand reveal. My wife, my bank, my potential CFO, my competitor, and he stared at Catherine Morrison, the executive I tried to hire to save my company, all working together against me. Not against you, Richard, I corrected calmly. Against your mismanagement, your deception, and your betrayal. Please, sit. This meeting actually represents an opportunity you don't yet understand. An opportunity? He scoffed, but finally moved to the chair. What possible opportunity could exist in this room full of people who engineered my destruction? The opportunity to salvage a professional future from the wreckage of your choices, I replied. For the next hour, we outlined the proposed restructuring. The company would be renamed Morrison Strategic Communications, with Catherine as CEO and Wells as CFO. Hargrove would serve as chairman, lending his industry credibility to reassure nervous clients. Richard would be offered a senior client relationship director position, a role that would utilize his personal connections while keeping him far from financial decisions or operational control. Throughout the presentation, Richard remained unnaturally quiet, his expression shifting between disbelief, anger, and occasional flashes of what might have been respect as he grasped the comprehensiveness of the plan. Why? He finally asked when the outline was complete. Why offer me any position at all? You've clearly won, Alexandra. You could simply exile me professionally and be done with it. Because despite everything, the clients trust you, I answered. Honestly. And because 37 employees deserve leadership that values their contributions. This isn't about winning, Richard. It's about rectifying a situation you created. And if I refuse this generous offer? His tone made the adjective sound like an insult. Edward leaned forward. Then the bank forecloses on all business assets, your personal guarantees are activated, and your professional reputation, already damaged, becomes unsalvageable. The choice is simple: adaptation or extinction. Richard turned to me, ignoring the others. You orchestrated all of this from the moment you discovered my affair, didn't you? The debt repayment, the bank acquisition, the covenant triggers, everything calculated to bring us to exactly this moment. Yes, I acknowledged simply. A strange expression crossed his face, something between bitterness and admiration. I never saw it coming. Not any of it. I thought I was the strategist in our relationship. A common misconception, I replied. He laughed then, a short, harsh sound devoid of humor. I suppose I have no choice but to accept. You always have choices, Richard. You simply need to live with their consequences. The meeting concluded with tentative agreement on next steps. Richard would be given 24 hours to formally accept the offer, after which the restructuring would be announced. The employees would be informed immediately, emphasizing continuity of employment and client service despite the leadership changes. As everyone began gathering their materials, Richard asked for a moment alone with me. The others filed out, leaving us facing each other across the conference table. 12 years of marriage, he said quietly. Did any of it mean anything to you? It meant everything until you decided it meant nothing, I replied. The moment you began planning to take half of my family's legacy while sleeping with your employee, you redefined our relationship. I simply adjusted accordingly. I never wanted to hurt you, Alex. I just wanted freedom to pursue your vision, I finished. For him. Yes, I remember your exact words when serving me divorce papers. Strange how that vision required my money, but not my presence. He had the grace to look ashamed. I made a monumental mistake. Several, actually. But who's counting? I stood, gathering my portfolio. The offer stands until tomorrow afternoon. Senior Client Relationship Director. No financial authority, no operational control, but a respectable position with appropriate compensation. And us? The divorce? He asked hesitantly. We'll proceed. As planned 1 year from the post-nuptial signing, per our agreement. In the meantime, we maintain an appropriate professional distance. And Vanessa? I smiled thinly. Your personal life remains your own concern, though I understand she's quite upset about the sudden change in your financial circumstances. The Soho apartment remains in the shell company's name, which is now under bank control, but we've decided not to evict her immediately. Consider it a professional courtesy. Richard's shoulders slumped in defeat. You've thought of everything. Not everything, I corrected him. Just everything that matters. I moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. You know, Richard, you could have had it all. Our marriage, your company's success, a genuine legacy. All you had to do was honor your commitments. I see that now, he admitted quietly. Hindsight is rarely comforting, but it is instructive. I opened the door. I'll expect your decision by 3 tomorrow. As I walked from the room, I felt the weight of the past months lifting. The meticulous planning, the strategic maneuvering, the careful documentation, all of it had culminated in this controlled resolution. Richard would accept the offer. His alternatives were non-existent. The company would survive under new leadership. The employees would retain their jobs. And I would finally close this chapter of my life with the knowledge that justice, however complicated, had been served. My phone buzzed with a text from Elise. Phase 4. Complete. Next steps? I smiled as I typed my response. Begin Phase 5. Moving. Forward. After all, the best revenge wasn't just about dismantling what was wrong. It was about building something better in its place. And unlike Richard, I intended to honor that commitment fully. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.